Hello, everyone. I'm really glad you could join us, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy. My name is Kristina Torres. I'm your moderator today for this webinar, which is being presented by NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. I'm very glad you could join us. We're going to take a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to log on. And so let me take care of a little bit of quick housekeeping. Just to let you know, the session is expected to run about an hour. We're going to have a conversation, but we also want to address your questions. If you have a comment or opinion, you're welcome to throw that in too. Your microphones will be muted, but please do share what you're thinking in the Q&A tab. I'll keep an eye on it, or Kimmy will keep an eye on it, and we'll do our best to address what you're thinking as time permits. So I also want to let you know this presentation is being recorded, and we'll be posting it soon on the nlgja.org website, so keep a lookout for that. And with all that out of the way, I'm excited to turn to today's conversation, which spotlights two of our really great Excellence in Journalism Award winners. So joining us is Excellence in Travel Writing recipient Allison Hope, as well as Excellence in Feature Writing Non-Daily Award recipient Rachel Weiss. So Allison and Rachel are going to talk about their work, and they're going to talk about their ideas about the importance of and really care required to document LGBTQ+ communities that journalists may not be a part of. And as part of our conversation, we'll also explore how they developed their award-winning projects and why they believe projects like theirs are important. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Kristina Torres. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a national board member of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and have been honored to serve as this year's committee chair of the 2020 Excellence in Journalism Award. So I will stop there and allow Rachel and Allison to introduce themselves. Rachel, if we could, let's start our introduction with you. Just please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Rachel Weiss. My pronouns are she, her, and hers as well. I am a digital reporter and producer at Newsday. I write a lot of profiles, human interest pieces, and feature stories, and I also produce videos for Newsday.com about all kinds of things and people around Long Island. I'm also one of the hosts of Newsday's Alexa daily news briefings, and I'm very excited to be here with you all. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, glad you're here. Allison, go for it.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and for the honor with the NLGJA. I'm a freelance writer, and I daytime as a marketer and PR exec, and then moonlight as a journalist, and have for many years, largely covering social issues in the LGBTQ beat, increasingly for mainstream outlets, but also cover a variety of other topics in the lifestyle, travel, and other spaces. I've written for the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC, Slate, Cosmo, kind of the full gambit. And a pleasure to be here today and be in conversation with you guys.
All right, awesome. Well, Allison, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with your piece, which you did for CNN Travel. And it's obviously about travel, but in this case about the complications and things that happen with many of folks in the trans community that they've faced, and other travelers, I'm sure, don't unfortunately give a second thought to. Why don't you talk a little bit about the piece and kind of how you came to it?
Sure. I'm happy to. So it's interesting, you know, I'm always mining for news story ideas, and generally the way that I think I'm naturally inclined to think is in trying to uncover those corners and those sectors that haven't yet been covered. What is the story that nobody has yet told? And the stories that I find that end up being the most valuable are the ones that feel obvious to me. Like, how is this something that has not yet been covered? But actually, it is something that has not really been broadly covered before, or covered in a way that is comprehensive or nuanced. And that was really the wonderful opportunity and privilege that I had with this piece for CNN, which was looking at the full spectrum of travel with regards to the transgender, non-binary community, and frankly, actually, cisgender people who just don't fit the bill of traditionally, you know, binary male or female, and just all of the touch points along your travel journey that many people don't even think twice about, from going through TSA to getting on an airplane airplane to renting a hotel room or an Airbnb to trying to hail a taxi, or just walking down a street in another country where the laws may not be on your side and where social norms may not be, accustomed to how you look or identify. And just all of the sort of challenges that, that a gender non-conforming, I should say, broadly speaking, community faces. And so I spoke with a great diverse array of members of the trans and non-binary community and others, as well as experts within all facets of the travel industry, from the Airbnbs and the airlines to TSA, which was a fun romp, and happy to talk more about that.
Well, we're definitely going to get into that. And one thing just struck me as interesting, and Rachel, this goes to you, is Allison was kind of this broad, and she talked about all the people she talked to and the insight that's in the piece, which I think is fantastic. You, on the other end, had this story that has an opening scene that I love, because we've all done home DNA tests, or at least know what they are, and you have a protagonist who, in her words, took the test thinking she was going to be told, yeah, you're half Polish, except she found out a lot more than that. And so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what your story said.
Sure. My approach to this story was actually, I was thinking about writing a more general piece about the intersex community on Long Island. And as you said, I ended up finding Dawn, and the story became so much more personal, but I think also so much bigger because of what I found. And basically, Dawn Covino adopted 2 twins from Kazakhstan, and she wanted to learn a little more about their ancestry. So she got a 23andMe kit to submit their DNA and find out. And then she just figured on a whim, oh, I'll throw mine in there too and see if it can really say that I'm half Polish, and see if it's accurate or not. And what ended up happening was 23andMe got in touch with her. They said, there's a problem with your sample. She sent another sample, and then a geneticist got in touch with her and said, it's coming up as XY chromosomes. It's kind of confusing, and asked her a few more questions on the phone. And then right then and there, she was diagnosed with androgen insensitivity syndrome, which falls under the intersex umbrella. And as I talked to Dawn more, I learned that throughout her childhood, throughout her life, she always knew that there was something different about her, but she never knew what it was. And she finally got that answer at age 38 through 23andMe. So it was an extremely interesting story. I was really honored to tell it. It was also her coming out story, besides her family, and I think maybe some close friends. Nobody in her life knew this about her. So I learned a lot from her, and I'm really happy that I got to talk to her. And the whole reason that I wanted to pursue this topic in the first place was because one of my best friends is intersex, and I kind of realized one day, I don't know anything about this. I don't know about this community. I don't know about what it even means to be intersex. Like, I really wanted to learn, and I'm so glad I got to.
But the amazing thing to me is, and you talked about, you have a good friend who's intersex, and you wanted to learn and kind of approach it that way. But how did you find Dawn? How did you make that connection?
Right. So Newsday is a local paper on Long Island. So with all of our stories, we kind of have to localize bigger topics, which is great. So, I reached out to Interact, which is an advocacy group based in Massachusetts. And they offer resources and current events about just intersex youth. So I reached out to them. I explained my story idea to Hans Lindahl, who is the communications director, and she got me in touch with Dawn, who was in their database and happened to be living on Long Island. So it was kind of a perfect fit. It was a great connection. And I reached out to Dawn, and she took about a month to decide that she wanted to do the story, because of course it was a huge deal. And then she ended up wanting to do it because she wanted to tell her story, and knew that there are other people out there like her, maybe not on Long Island, but probably. And so she took the opportunity to use it as her platform, which was great.
Well, and this almost gets to this idea of source building, and sort of one of the broad topics we can discuss is this idea of covering a community you may not be a part of. With Allison, you mentioned with your story of trans community or gender nonconforming. How did you approach that in terms of, where did you start reaching out and trying to go in that way? You with the folks in your story, I mean, a lot of them are very well known in the trans community and have something to say.
Yeah, I think it's such a critical topic in terms of source building, and in particular when you're working with communities where there might be trauma, or there might be sensitivities, or there might be a history of actually being sort of exploited for the purposes of storytelling, or other inclinations. I think building relationships is so key, and I'm very, very grateful that I've been a part of the LGBTQ community and worked in advocacy circles and spaces for many years. So I usually start in a piece like that with my known contacts. And I recognize there's sort of implicit bias therein, and so I'm always trying to act against that and thinking about what is the broadest and most diverse possible net I can cast in terms of sourcing for stories. But do start with the people I know, and the people who know can trust me that I'm going to handle the subject matter and as sensitively, intelligibly as possible. And then I'll go from there to the sort of more formal network of advocacy organizations, nonprofits, subject matter experts. Sometimes I'll do plenty of times I'll do cold outreach to experts who may have offered an interesting or important perspective in a different media outlet, or, a different sort of research paper, et cetera. And then reach out like through broader networks from there. If it's, traditional kind of PR circles or channels, calling for sources, or reaching out to the larger organizations and brands. But some of it is relationship building. There were certainly subjects I worked with for this story in particular, and for others who had gone through horrible circumstances with TSA at security checkpoints at airports, and they didn't know me. Maybe they came through a friend of someone who knew me, or somebody who'd posted on their social media on behalf of the reporter looking for sources. And I had to build that trust through conversations, and show that I had that sensitivity, that I was looking to represent them and their story fairly and accurately. And I think that comes with some time, which I know we don't always have. We don't always have when we're working on stories. In this case, I was grateful to have that time and to be able to build those relationships.
Well, as journalists, we understand sometimes our calling card is word of mouth, right? It is the trust you build with one source who can go to someone else they know that you may never met or heard of, and say, yeah, you can trust this person. They will tell your story accurately. They would be fair, that type of thing. Rachel, how did, with you, with Dawn, you mentioned reaching out, and she took a month to kind of think it through. And I have to assume, and there's an antidote here I'm going to get to in a second, talk to her husband and try and just figure out if she wanted to move forward. In that space, did you continue to contact her? Did you kind of back off and say, look, I'm not going to bug you. Just let me know when you're ready? How did you approach that?
I completely backed off. I waited for her. I said, take all the time you need. I was hoping to tie the story to Intersex Awareness Day, which was in October. And I believe I reached out to her. I think the first time I reached out to her was in August or July, maybe, of last year. So, but after I reached out to her the first time, I said, just take your time. And then we would text a little bit. She would ask me a few questions like, will this be on video? And I would say no, and I would record it, but that would just be for me to write the story. So we would text a little bit back and forth, and then finally when she said yes, that's when I went and interviewed her at her house. But yeah, I can imagine she spoke to her husband to see if she wanted to do it or not, and ultimately decided to. And I think something else that's important was before I interviewed her, I did as much research as possible about intersex identity. It's so important to do that, not only when you're writing the story, obviously, when you're consulting a media guide or a language guide, which you should also do as well. But before you actually do your interview, if you just do your research and know what you're talking about, you can have a more thoughtful and dynamic and respectful conversation, which I think that's what we ended up having, because I ended up knowing so much more about the topic than I did when I first wanted to pursue the story.
Right.
And I think doing those things like that is, not only makes for a better interview, but it also makes for just a more respectful conversation. So I think I'm really glad that I did that. And, I think she was too.
Well, and some things work out the way you don't expect them to, but they work out better. So the anecdote that I loved in your story was when she told her husband. You mentioned this was kind of a coming out story, and she had been coming out on this journey, and how they had gone out to dinner, and she finally said, look, I have something to tell you. And she told him, and he froze, and she thought, oh my God. And he was like, I thought you were telling me you had cancer.
Right.
Like, it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That's a heck of a story that she trusted with you to be able to convey to readers and folks who read your story that this is okay. It's brave, and she's on her journey.
Absolutely. And, those anecdotes like that with, her husband and other things like her high school experience and, just the fact that she's a psychologist now,
Right.
helping youth um, with their self esteem, which is, she's offering help that she never got as a child. Those were things that I thought were really important to include in the story because you have these two big elements to it, which is the 23andMe and maybe the surgery that she underwent. That's another big element to it. And also just the age that she found this out about herself. But I think for a more well-rounded story and a more sensitively told story is where you can really develop the character and give them the space to really just describe them as a person. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. It was my favorite anecdote, the story. It was great. And with Allison, with your piece and talking to, I mean, you mentioned sort of that you were kind of building blocks, right? You're kind of building up the story. You had time to do it, which, we're acknowledging on deadline, that may be a little hard, but it's, as you kept talking to folks, going through, as you said, everyone from sources to people you may not know to advocacy, advocacy groups. Um, did you find in that, as Rachel was describing, as your knowledge built up and your understanding of certain things, like, with TSA, which we'll get to in a second, that helped, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, to Rachel's point, doing your homework in advance of actually talking to your sources is critical because you need that in order to establish that trust. And frankly, you need it to inform the piece, and so that background is so important. And, Rachel also said something else that really resonated. And I think it gets at the heart of what we all do and what we're all passionate about as media makers. Is that humans and human interest in people are at the heart and center of everything that we do. And I think it can be easy to get sort of mechanical in story creation and to think about, here's where I need to plug this element in, and then for the end user too, for a reader to be to sort of pigeonhole or stereotype or read a story at face value. I think the biggest service that we can do as journalists is to care about the people at the center of our stories and to sort of hold them up and value them as sort of multifaceted human beings, and do everything that we can to have that shine through in the final product of our stories. I think is just really important. And so the research is a critical part of that. It's making sure that we've got our facts straight. We have a heightened responsibility to do that now more than ever. And especially if we're dealing with sensitivities and with demographics that have, particular, they already have odds against them in terms of a marginalization or discrimination. How do we kind of myth bust and stereotype bust by portraying our subjects as rich human beings, whose lives are valued and matter as much as we may value our own.
Right, and this is happening, of course, in this sort of broader context of fake news, right? That someone's going to try and shoot a hole through what you're doing, or there's going to be a question about accuracy or reporting or facts. How do you deal with that? It's just, I mean, step out broadly. It doesn't have to be about this piece of how do you step back and say, no, I've done this. I know it's right. No, you said this, that's not right. I'm going to push back on that. How do you deal with that? Allison, you go first.
Yeah, sure. I think that's something that is more top of mind than ever, understanding the climate in which we're operating, where, let's be real. Fake news has been a propaganda tagline, but it's also been in part whispers of reality with shrinking newsrooms and fact-checking editors and all the rest. So the impetus is on us, I think, more than ever to be the fact checkers and to ensure that what we're putting out is accurate. And, you know, I feel that heightened responsibility. I feel that weight, especially when a story is going out that represents a more, you know, a community that's already at the margins, to want to get it right. So that's, you know, that's where I lose sleep, you know, literally. Like, I will just make sure I am up late enough to do all the fact checking that I can do, to do the extra gut checks, and to appreciate the rigorous fact checking process that I do get to embark on with, you know, editors as partners, at the outlets in which I work. You know, I think actually CNN, which this piece was published in and who I write for, often on the LGBTQ beat, I actually have been surprised, by how they've moved further towards fact checking and rigor in fact checking and reporting. I think the more fire they've come under as one of the key sort of targets of the current administration over the last 4 years has been, that they've actually tightened their belts on fact checking. And they're one of the most rigorous that I work with. So people may find that sort of ironic, but I appreciate that. I think we're in an era where, claims of fake news ring true. It's hard for many readers, and for people who get it, you know, majority of people who are getting their news from social media feeds and scrolls, are able to trust, what they're clicking on. And the last thing I want is to be on the receiving end of misinformation, you know, to be the perpetuator of misinformation in some way, and be on the receiving end rather when a piece publishes. So I do all the work as hard as I can. I lose the sleep. I appreciate the process. And then I kind of hold my breath. I think when the piece goes live, I wait anxiously, to see what Twitter is saying, and making sure, there will always be the trolls, but making sure that the allies in the piece, are happy with it. That is the true testament to me for, you know, that I've done right by my subjects.
Right. I want to come back to that, but in the second, Rachel, you of course talked about, we have CNN and then we have Newsday, which you described as local, although I point out they're pretty big and pretty well known. But how do you go about that process? And in terms of what Allison just described, is it very similar, or do you have kind of a different thing you follow?
It's a little bit different. Just in my case specifically, I do a lot of feature stories, but I mean, like Allison, you know, when my stories come out, even if it's about like a Halloween costume drive run by like a nonprofit group, I'm still like, oh, I hope they really like it. Like, it's still, there's a lot of stress and kind of an extra layer of pressure added, just by the climate that we're in right now, just to get everything right and make sure that the sources like the stories and are okay with them and there's nothing incorrect in them. For me, like, I just keep a very, very open line of communication, like Allison, with my editors at all times. I have a few different editors that I report to that read my work, which is great. It's really important to have multiple points of view, multiple eyes on the work. With Dawn's story in particular, many editors read that, which was great. And, you know, along with Dawn, I did a few other interviews that all the editors felt were essential to the piece as well, just to make for a more well-rounded story, with a doctor and two advocates, actually. So yeah, it is a little bit different than CNN, but it is very much the same of just, you know, keeping in touch with your editors, taking your time during the reporting process when you can, and, you know, just fact checking everything independently. It's all, you know, very, very more important than ever before, for sure.
Well, to me, the interesting thing is, you know, the fake news and having this discussion about, you know, just stressing the accuracy of losing sleep and having that feeling in the pit of your stomach to make sure you've got it right and you've done, you know, you've honored everyone and done them right. But it's also coming at a time when we're talking about this kind of false equivalency, this idea of balance and you know, gosh, the easy example is climate change. If 99.9% of scientists say yes, but you feel like you have to get that 0.1% that says, oh no, it's just, there's nothing going on here. How do you both deal with that? How do you find you have to kind of approach that with editors who may come at you and say, well, you need to go find someone who believes X instead of Y? Allison, why don't you take that on first?
Wow, I'm really grateful that I don't cross that often. Part of it is that I write a lot of opinion stuff, so I get to be pointed, and I get to be I try never to be one-sided. I always actually, just as an exercise of rigor, will read the most intelligible counter arguments just to make sure I'm sort of addressing and crossing off on those points. But thank God I can't recall a time in which I've had an editor say, you have to include this opposing view, which might fly in the face of sort of facts. I've not had that.
Okay, Rachel, have you? Is that something you've encountered?
I haven't personally, but Newsday does cover, both sides of everything. Like, we have rallies on Long Island that are pro-Trump. We have rallies on Long Island that are pro-Biden. We just try to get reporters at all of it. I haven't had to cover anything personally like that. I've never really come across a time where I've had to get both sides in the way that you're describing, but that's mostly because I write a lot of feature stories and things like that. But it is an interesting point for sure.
Did you get any pushback when you went to, an editor or editors and said, I want to write about the intersex community. This is very important. We need to do this. Did anyone, just playing devil's advocate, say, why?
I didn't get any pushback like that, actually. I did get, people didn't know what it was, and I would try to explain it to them as best as I could, because at that point I didn't know too much either when I first pitched it. But all of the editors that I worked with were extremely curious, extremely open, and wanted to learn with me as we kind of went along. And I was really grateful for that. It was honestly a great reporting and writing experience where I think we all learned a lot.
That's good. Allison, how about you in terms of how you approach your stories? And obviously you talked about you do freelance and you're kind of doing these kind of step back bigger pieces, but
yeah, I would say first, to the point about pushback on certain topics, I've experienced a real evolution over time in mainstream media's sort of openness and appetite for telling those more marginalized stories. And I think the rate of my rejection on story pitches is probably like the barometer that I measure media's openness to telling certain stories. So I think over time there's been more and more of an openness and less pushback on raising some of those voices that haven't been raised or that have only been raised in niche spaces and niche beats and outlets historically. So I think that's wonderful. Like there's wonderful progress being made, including outlets that might be, historically more centrist or more right-leaning or more right. I think most of them have gotten better at wanting to include LGBTQ voices and to tell those nuanced stories therein, right? Like the experience of a transgender person going through a security checkpoint at the airport at TSA. CNN probably appreciates that maybe impacts just a couple of percent of the entire population, but that it's an important story to tell. And so they're going to allow space to be able to tell it, for that story to be told. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I in some ways I see some of the rejection historically of some of these ideas as the evolution of the media being open to these stories. I'm trying to think of an instance in which I've been explicitly told this story is too narrow or impacts too small of a group for it to be considered, and I don't recall that, but I feel like those words might be implicit and not explicitly stated historically.
right. And to a degree, I'm thinking of folks, I live in Atlanta and it's the South, and there are communities here where I think you probably would get pushback. And it also depends on how well you might know a community and that type of thing. It's my sense is it certainly happens, but it's also, to me, really heartening to hear that you both are like, no, actually, I can talk about my ideas and someone helps me develop them. The idea of developing a story, because it's hard when you work by yourself, but if you have a community of your journalism colleagues, that certainly helps.
Absolutely.
So,
And I feel like during the process, a lot of my editors started to really care for Dawn. And,
yeah.
it was her coming out story, and they all wanted to make sure that she felt comfortable. And, at least when I interviewed her, they were like, was she okay? Is it all good? And so it was great to have a team of editors with me every step of the way.
Well, and with Dawn, you mentioned she's a psychologist, but she talked about growing up and feeling different and being bullied and not being able to sort of, I don't want to say put a name on it, but to be able to just kind of have a definitive idea of why it was happening. Right. And she went through surgery but that didn't answer anything. It was a procedure and the doctor really didn't explain anything. A deeply personal story. So I'm actually excited to hear your editors were like, no, we need to make sure it's done right. But her
Yeah,
story is
absolutely.
honored.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and again, I'm just so happy that she trusted me with it. And it was really one of the highlights of my career so far is just not only being able to tell the story and just the whole experience of it, but also the feedback that I've gotten from the intersex community. It's just, it means a lot. It really did. And I really appreciate, Interact, specifically the advocacy group I mentioned earlier, helped me also every step of the way. So it was a really special experience. And like you said, a very, very personal story.
Right. And I'm assuming that they posted on like listservs. To me, would have a national audience. Did you get a sense they did that?
I know that it got picked up by a few different news sources. I'm not sure which ones, and I know that other news sources were reaching out to her to see if she wanted to tell them her story. And then she would reach out to me and say, "Is this a good news source?" um, but yeah, yeah, I do. It did really well in terms of metrics on our website too. So I did get a sense that it was doing well and serving a bigger audience than I expected, for sure.
Right. And people found it and shared it, hopefully.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Allison, with yours, what I loved is that, it was so in depth and it sort of expressed so much knowledge, but to a degree, it was also kind of a how-to guide. It was saying, okay, be aware of this. You need to think about this. Here's something else you should be aware of. We talked about TSA. We've been talking about that a little bit. I was stunned to know that there's no formal guidelines or training and about preferred gender identity or how to deal with identity documents. If you have a question, I'm almost surprised they would actually talk to you and say, oh no, we don't know. Never mind.
Yeah, it was sort of a stunning experience trying to dig into some of that stuff. And as it turned out, to your first point, I did see that the piece was being shared by the trans community as sort of a guide, which is wonderful. And I have a background in advocacy, so knowing that, like, I understand very well and appreciate how journalism and media making and storytelling go hand in hand with education and with creating social change. And to the extent to which some of these pieces can help educate and move people to to have greater empathy for the trans community, for certain communities, depending on what I'm covering, that is like the penultimate, that it's that it transcends, my byline, it transcends anything else, and really is a resource and a vehicle. And I've seen firsthand in the advocacy community how communications and just strong pieces of writing can do that. Maybe I'll save the anecdote for another time, or if we have time later, because it's not immediately relevant. But one of the things that came out of the CNN piece was actually a second piece just focused on TSA and trans people and the challenges they face going through security checkpoints, because that really was a standout point from the first piece that had not really been explored in depth on a national platform like CNN. And the stories that I got from people were just, more than I could include, and just horrific. And TSA, had no qualms about sharing their wholly inadequate procedures and policies. And essentially, to share a little bit.
Please.
Yes, and I feel like a lot of people don't actually know this. I didn't know this until I went through the sort of research and discovery process for this piece, that when you go to a security checkpoint at the airport, you are deemed immediately upon eye contact only by a TSA agent roughly 20 feet away, whether you're male or female, and they hit a button accordingly. And then you go through the body scanner machine, and the body scanner reads you as if you are whatever button was selected, male or female. And so the machine is not very intelligent, right? It's taught to look for abnormalities based on the male or female button. So for instance, if the TSA agent deemed you male and hit the male button, but there's a bulge in your chest area, the body scanner will beep. The alarm will go off. It'll alert the TSA agent there's an abnormality. That's when you get subjected to the pat down and to further sort of investigation where all kinds of things can go awry. I spoke with people who were taken into back rooms and asked to take their clothes off entirely. TSA agents putting their hands on people's bodies. There were plenty of things that the TSA says was a violation of their policies. Many complaints lodged for those types of violations, but they persist nonetheless. And even when they don't, there's obviously a violation of your own personhood, I would say, right? Showing up at a security checkpoint and being sort of judged in the most superficial way, with actually zero guidance given to TSA. Like, what does a TSA agent even understand about what makes male, what makes female, without talking to a human being that they're sort of prejudging and potentially submitting to invasive, unnecessary, potentially illegal procedures. So just astounding. And I hope the piece raised some awareness around that. And I hope, I have not seen any sort of protocol or policy changes coming out of TSA as a result, but I hope that keeps the pressure on them, and that the pressure continues to be, again, the idea of sort of journalism for social change, which is my ethos.
Well, you had antidotes as well in your story. That one, this idea of, all right, I'm going to approach this. I'm going to have to myself, before I even go through the checkpoint, I'm going to address myself because I don't want someone else to do it. And I'm going to do one thing and go and tell them one thing. And then I'm going to go through security, and then I'm going to go back and redress myself and sort of become me again. I don't think anyone thinks about that, how demeaning it is and how inhuman and depersonalizing it is. It goes back to this idea of having someone trust you enough to tell that story so that people understand, who will read your piece on CNN Travel, that actually happens. They actually do have two buttons. They have it's very, binary, male, female, and that's how they move on. It's to me, it was stunning. I keep using that word, but it's, you said it led to a second piece, and I'm assuming it maybe a little bit further into that.
Yeah, the second piece was focused just on TSA and security. So the TSA media relations team was, I'm sure, thrilled to hear from me again, and to get many requests for more detailed information about their processes, digging through complaints, digging through, and collecting the stories of the many moments of trauma that trans and non-binary people. And again, actually through a very personal anecdote, but through the research process for the story, we realized my wife, who is, cisgender, female identified, but not overtly feminine looking necessarily. We figured that's actually why she gets stopped every time we go through TSA security checkpoint, because she's read as male, most likely, by a TSA agent, and gets the kind of full effect of TSA, which we had just had no idea what they're sort of, and I think most people don't. So you don't have to be, transgender to be sort of alarmed by this or informed by this. But the stories are just awful, right? Imagine having to shed who you are just to survive a few moments on what should otherwise be, a mundane business trip or an exciting vacation, and meanwhile you're having to hide who you are so that you don't get harassed or assaulted. It's
right. Something other people take for granted. Just, I'll go through, I have my expedited pass. I'm just going to take me 5 minutes to go, and I can start walking to my gate and get my coffee. Yeah. Right. And it's not just obviously TSA, it's also traveling to other countries and, you know, whether it's passport or dealing with law enforcement in a foreign country that may have just maybe outright, you know, just antagonistic about who they think you are. All that factors into what the story was about and what you found.
Yeah, it's really every touch point on a journey, literally your journey, that like you said, most people just don't even think about. And you know, that I would say that it transcends just this one community when we're thinking about what stories do we tell. You know, that is essentially, you know, what I hope to do all the time is to you know, to sort of embed that empathy in more people who maybe aren't thinking in their day to day about the challenges that other people might be going through, to do the simplest of things and the most mundane of tasks. And that's really where helping other people to tell their story brings some of those things to surface. And I hope, especially in these really divided times, can help bring people just a little bit more into full understanding of what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, and maybe think twice about our sort of assumptions.
Right, and that's a great point. I mean, Rachel with Dawn, it's I think her overall point was that, yeah, my life is, I'm not mundane. I love my life, I love my kids, I love my husband, but it's not like, you know, I'm anything extraordinary. I'm me, right? It's
Absolutely.
an amazing thing to be able to say this. Actually, it's people are going to make a big deal, but it's not. I'm me.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought what the most important quote from her was, there's so many different parts of me. And that's kind of what I wanted the whole story to reflect. Also, I think Allison touched on something great. I really think, and I agree, as journalists, we have the opportunity to be allies with everything we do. Like, we can take our platform and use it to uplift marginalized communities anytime. And I think doing that is by telling these stories, also just using as many quotes as possible. That's something that I like to do, just letting the source speak for themselves in their own words. And again, just finding the stories. And I know Alice mentioned this before. A lot of these things that we want to write about are things that we're like, you know, why hasn't this been written about yet? It's like shocking to us. And it's great that we're getting to do it. But yeah, you know, going back to what you said earlier, and I think I said this earlier as well, just the little things about Dawn, like, you know, her high school experience and her becoming a psychologist, and even her kids. Like, I thought it was important to mention them. It's all those little things that some editors, not my editors, but some editors might think are trivial and don't matter, but it's what makes up the big picture. And, you know, that's really what I wanted to reflect in Dawn's story.
Is there anything about her story that surprised you, or about doing the story itself?
Well, the 23andMe thing was a huge bomb that was dropped because she didn't tell me about that before I got to her house. I found out on the spot, you know, while I was interviewing her. So that shocked me, and I knew that it would surprise readers as well. But it's actually not that common. You know, a lot of the feedback that I got from the intersex community after the piece came out was that it's not that common to find out in a way like this,
Hmm.
in such an unusual way, and at the age that she did. So it did surprise me that that is more common than we think in the intersex community, to, you know, not be told everything in the moment, and just learn these things on your own later in life. Um, and it doesn't speak for the whole community, but it is a lot of people's experiences that I found that reached out to me after the story came out. So I thought that that was interesting.
And that to me was huge. You led with it. I mean, that just
Yeah.
took you in immediately because, I mean, like I said, this testosterone is ubiquitous now. I think everyone thinks, oh yeah, you spit into a tube and you know you find out you're half foolish. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
so let's look a little bit forward now for both of you, and don't yell at me. I hope I'm not getting too personal, but what's next for each of you? Rachel, what do you see yourself doing? You covered a little bit about religion. I know you said you do feature stories and sort of look for characters and personalities. What do you want to do moving forward?
Right. Moving forward, I'm hoping to tell more stories like Dawn's, to tell more stories about the LGBTQ plus community. Before the pandemic, I was working on a project about the funeral industry. I kind of bounced back and forth between topics, but that was a big thing I was working on for a while. So I'm hoping to get back to that, although it's going to be a much different project now, considering everything that's going on. But things like that. I do a lot of multimedia projects, which means I do a lot of long form writing, and I help produce videos to accompany it and kind of intertwine them on the web page. I'm hoping to do more things like that, but overall, I mean, telling Dawn's story was huge for me, and I'm really hoping to do more things like that in the future. um, it's so important that we keep telling these stories and telling them right.
I was about to say, anytime you get a story like that, I think that it's special. You don't, doesn't take like someone ringing a bell. You're just like, yeah, this is a great story. This is awesome. Did you get that feeling with Dawn?
I did, but at the same time, I was so focused on telling it in a sensitive way, that I kind of was distracted by that almost. I knew that it was a great story, but what concerned me most was, Hans Lindahl from Interact had sent me an intersex language sensitivity guide and media guide for covering intersex issues. I was doing tons of research, and so while I knew it was a great story, I knew that it was even more important to just tell it right. And I guess that kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but I knew it was a great story, but I was really, really concerned about telling it in a sensitive and respectful way. So that kind of distracted me from the whole, 23andMe of it all.
Right, right. And any concerns that people would say, why are you telling this story? It's not your story.
I had that concern a lot,
Yeah.
honestly, but I think the way that I worked through that was, again, working with Interact, just knowing that, for me, the language of the story was everything. Just making sure that I was phrasing everything correctly, and, referring to things correctly, and just doing as much research as I could. The fact that I was able to interview Hans, and a doctor, and another advocate from the LGBT community who's based on Long Island, kind of helped me think that I was doing it correctly, just by talking to them, and making sure I'm including all of their quotes directly from them, and as many as I could. So yeah, I did have that concern a lot, and I still do all the time. But I mean, I think it turned out okay, thankfully, and I think that's because of all the research I did, honestly. And I probably couldn't have done it without the help of Interact, because they provided so many resources for me, that while I was writing it, I felt like I was also learning a lot at the same time.
Good, good. Allison, I know you mentioned your bailiwick is PR and marketing, but it sounds to me like you love to write and tell stories.
I mean, it's all one and the same, right? I think at the heart of all of it is story making, and how do you communicate out an important point, ideally with people at center. How are we uplifting one another? So that's I started writing bad poetry when I was 8, and like, I'm just a writer, so I'll always be a writer. In terms of next chapter, I don't know. I feel like we're at this pivot point. The last 4 years have felt like hair on fire, breaking news must hold feet to the fire and hold those in power accountable. And so a lot of my work has been kind of reactionary to the things that are happening and breaking, to try to, keep people informed and hopefully, accountable. I don't know what's next. It would be great if I could move from a place where I'm making people kind of energized and angry, in a good way, angry politically, to maybe making them laugh. I don't know. Could we be entering an era? Maybe I pray and hope where we can start to do that and reflect in different ways. That would be wonderful. If there are any literary agents on the webinar, I can give you my cell phone number. That would be great. I always have a couple like books in the hopper that are not quite done that I'm working on. So I always lose attention on those when there's the breaking news thing, and I'm
Right.
writing 800-word piece on deadline. But yeah, I'm very open to new opportunities and to new exciting projects and topics, and I hope that there is less hair on fire in the next 4 years to come.
I think we all hope that. You mentioned with the freelance, do you set it up so you have certain pieces in the pipeline, or is it kind of what comes to you in the moment and then you kind of run with that?
It's a good question. It's a little bit of both. I'm thinking about like longer lead stuff, the untold stories. People come to me with their untold stories. So if I see the diamond in the rough there, I may try to help uplift and pitch. And then yeah, there's always the hair on fire breaking news, which I try to combat in my head. Sometimes I don't need to weigh in on this story. Somebody else will tell it. I should get sleep. But often I find that I don't have a choice in the matter. It's just my reflex. I'm expert on this. This is breaking. There's an opportunity, and so I'll jump in, and then other things get pushed to the side. But so yeah, it's a combo, and it's something I really can't ever turn off. So I think about taking a break and just focusing on, my sort of central duties are focusing on, I don't know, a vacation, but that doesn't really happen. It just draws me back to the flame.
Well, I know you deserve a vacation, so we all deserve a vacation
this year. Yeah, I mean, let's be real, right? Most of us haven't gotten on a plane.
Sorry, next administration is going to be so boring. We're just not going to know what to do with ourselves because you don't have to keep checking social media. So
I hope you are right. I hope you're right. I will be on the first plane to the tropical island if anyone wants to join. Yeah.
Very good. Just one quick question got posted in the chat, and so I do want to address it with you both. This idea of identity and technology. Of what do you think the role of technology will play in the future of LGBTQ plus issues? It's a broad question, but Allison, I'm going to throw it to you first. Of kind of where do you think that might be going?
Yeah, I mean, I think, technology can mean so many things, right? So, we see things like the proliferation of digital connectivity, and, the ability to mobilize and the ability to connect across geographies and across identities and across, platforms, to create new communities and to kind of rise up together in singular voices that could not have happened historically. So I think technology will continue to drive those things. There are there's so many facets, right? When you think about AI and you think about, are there ways in which technology can actually help de-identify in certain instances so that bias becomes less of a concern for things like, applying for a job or even looking for a date or, I don't know, any of those sort of, applying for governmental services or, those kinds of things. I think technology potentially could be helpful, and there are always inherent risks every time, a new sort of technology or tool becomes available. I'm sure there are other things too, if I had a little while to think about it. But
well, and also playing with the idea that there are places all over, but including in this country, that don't really have consistent access to technology, may not have consistent access to broadband. The idea that, just as an example of college kids who may be home somewhere where they don't have that access and are driving to find a public library so they can try and do the homework or take the exam they need to continue their courses. Different ways of thinking about it. It's access to technology may mean no access to technology.
Yeah,
even as
absolutely.
Advance. Rachel, what do you think? Rachel, I'm going to be honest, you may have frozen a little bit.
So as the issue of access to technology, I recently wrote a story about that, about two communities on Long Island.
You got it. You're good.
Was I frozen?
Yeah, you're good though.
Okay, I had a feeling. Okay, great. Sorry for that. So
no, your fault.
Yeah, a lot of great points were just touched upon here. First of all, the issue of access is so important. I recently wrote a story about two communities on Long Island who, obviously everybody is remote learning right now, and these two communities did not have access to really any technology to do that. So two different organizations, one of them is Latino educators, the other one is Black educators, teamed up and provided tablets for so many young children in these communities so that they could learn. So hopefully in the future, we do see less of that, as one of my sources said in that story, digital gap. But going back to the actual question, Allison touched on something so great, which is we're already kind of seeing that this evolution in terms of, you know, people taking movements to social media. We saw that in June with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially, as well as in-person protests, of course. But I do think that in the future, social media in particular will become such an important tool to, you know, the LGBTQ community, communities of color, just to get their messages out there, get their points across. And we're already seeing it.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking on the question, number one, because I know it was broad. And number two, thank you for joining us. So before I wrap up, is there anything else, any final thoughts you want to pass along to folks as they go on their day?
Have a great day. And thank you so much for having me. And Allison, I really appreciate it. This was so great. And, you know, it was such an honor to win this award as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Allison, you good?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for the time and the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Well, I appreciate y'all sharing your thoughts. Just to wrap up for everyone, today's panelists, Allison Hope and Rachel Weiss, shared their insight, their experiences with our members and guests, and we really appreciate it. So my thanks to everyone for joining us today as well. NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, will continue to host additional webinars highlighting contributions of our Excellence in Journalism Award winners. So please do keep an eye out on our newsletter, on our website, on social media. We'll get that information out soon. And I appreciate seeing everyone. As I said, I hope everyone is safe, hope everyone is healthy, and I hope everyone enjoys the upcoming holidays. So I think we'll see each other soon. I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Thank